Okay, great. This is Ronan Hart with the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program on the Challenging Racism at UF project. I'm joined by my coworker,
Adolfo Romero.
And today is July 17th, 2023. And who do I have the pleasure of speaking with?
I'm Kenneth Sassaman, professor of anthropology at the University of Florida.
Okay. Could you spell your name out for the record?
Kenneth, Kenneth, Sassaman, Sassaman.
All right. So before you came to UF, or I guess when did you come to UF, and what was your impression of it before you did come?
I arrived at the University of Florida in the fall of 1998 to accept a position in the Department of Anthropology, assistant professor. And I'm an archaeologist. I'd been professionally employed in archaeology for about a dozen years before arriving here in '98. I was working at the University of South Carolina under contracts with the Department of Energy to provide archaeological services at a 300 square mile government facility known as the Savannah River site, off the Savannah River across from Augusta, Georgia. My impression of UF really probably centers on my own profession. Like, I knew very little about it. I wasn't following the university in general. I had no interest in its sports at that time. That, of course, has changed. So from an archaeological standpoint, UF is one of those paragons of excellence. The Florida Museum has a long-standing reputation for quality work. Some of the founders of Southeastern archaeology, the region in which I work, the Southeastern United States, they hail from UF. The founder of the Department of Anthropology was an archaeologist, John Goggin. Charles Fairbanks was legend in the field. He was a curator of archaeology over at the Florida Museum. So my impression of UF from my professional point of view as an archaeologist was quite high, but it didn't really expand beyond that. I didn't have really any touchstone for assessing, its place in the world of politics or economics or even in higher education for that matter. I was thrilled to get the job. I know that.
So what would you say has kept you here since 1998?
Well, it's been 25 years, hasn't it?
Yeah.
What's kept me here is that I really enjoy the job. It's an excellent department with good opportunity. I've been able to attract, train, and graduate, I think close to 20 PhDs now, who are, for the most part, pretty well placed in the profession. So it's been gratifying that the resources here and opportunities here have been conducive to student success and professional development. I tried to, until I became chair of the Department of Anthropology, first interim chair, then 3 years as the actual chair. Oh, geez, when was that? The late 20-aughts, just before the recession. Before then, I really had no purchase on the politics of this institution. Didn't really pay much attention. I knew at the time that the dean, Neil Sullivan, was a polymath, just a Renaissance guy that I admired enormously. He was always very encouraging, enthusiastic about any initiatives we would take. He seemed to be especially interested in innovation that would take us out of kind of the rut of, just the white male dominance of the science, right? That he was very much interested in diversifying the ranks, adding people of color into science and so forth, creating opportunity. So I think my initial impression of UF from an administrative point of view was quite positive. And then the recession hit, and then it became draconian, and things that were scrutinized for cuts, in my estimation, weren't always just about economics. That it was more, it came down to like, well, what do we really need around here? And I think the push for STEM really started to take off then, that we saw a greater emphasis in science, technology, engineering, and math, less so in the humanities and social sciences. But I got to tell you, as a chair during those years, this was pretty much, what was it, about 2006 through 2009, something like that. I actually took it up as a challenge to overcome those obstacles and limitations and find ways to garner resource and support for the things that anthropology wanted to do. And anthropology has always been about cultural diversity and relativism. So, we're at the forefront of like many of the issues that are now kind of surprising to me. Resurfacing, issues in the 50s and 60s that I thought we'd overcome with legislation and just social change, but it's almost like we've retrograded. So, so here we are in 2023, and I think we might have been better off in 2012.
Yeah. So in your time at UF, how did you see the way Native American history or Native American issues, maybe UF's relationship to Native American history, how is that represented at UF in terms of curricula, in your classes and other people's classes, just from what you saw? What was done well? What was maybe done not as well?
Mm-hmm. I've certainly seen a lot of change in the 25 years since I've been here, and much of that change has just unfolded rapidly in the last few years. So I think naively the first decade or so, I was coming from and continuing to replicate the model that the academy, the ivory tower, was best positioned to write the histories of Native North America because of the technologies that we have available to us. The higher education opens up the doors for research capacity and communication skills, both writing and speaking. Obviously, a higher education opens up doors in ways that most people don't have access to, like things like grant money from the National Science Foundation and so forth. So that first decade, I don't think I ever questioned that was the appropriate way to approach the history and the culture of Native America. I knew at UF, it didn't take me long to figure out, just by looking around and paying attention, that we had very few Native American students. It's less than 1%. I think it's less than 0.5% these days. And I knew of no Native American professors. I think over the years I heard rumor that there were a couple here and there, but I never met any. And contrast that with a place like the University of Oklahoma, or maybe like Simon Fraser up in British Columbia, where there's a large Native American constituency, not only amongst the students, but in the faculty ranks as well. So I knew that UF was different in that respect. I knew very little that first decade about the Seminole tribe of Florida, or the Miccosukee, who are the two federally recognized tribes in our state. I was still working up in Georgia and South Carolina in that first decade, and South Carolina had a federally recognized tribe, the Catawba, that I had some interaction with. I know the oral history program has done interviews over the decades.
We
with
just
them too.
Repatriated those interviews.
Yeah.
Recently.
Janessa Bahar has been keeping me abreast of those developments. Yeah. It's like, that's a really great project. Yeah, you guys are to be commended for that. Then in Georgia, there were no federally recognized tribes, so a lot of the work I was doing in Georgia was without consultation. So that first decade, it was still flying by the dominant model of white European descendant, highly educated people commanding this profession. And then in the second decade and leading up to the last 5 years, being nudged in that direction in part because of federal legislation. If we go back to 1990, the NAGPRA, Native American Graves Protection Repatriation Act, that was a game changer. But it took a long time for the game to change. So that first decade until about 2000, everybody was trying to feel their way through the complexities of this new legislation. No one really had capacity for fulfilling the obligation under the law. So not having staff, not having funding, not really having procedures, protocols for dealing with the requirements of the law. But being aware of it and being part of a larger professional community that's engaged in debate. So Kennewick Man, when he was discovered by erosion of the Columbia River and first assessed by a forensic anthropologist as being of European descent because he didn't look like an Indian in a skeletal way, kind of opened up a can of worms for a lot of us that we had never really confronted before, which is, do we have enough knowledge to adequately attribute any given human remain, a skeleton, a body, a person, an ancestral person, or their associated belongings? Do we have sufficient capacity to make accurate assessments of affiliation and then walk through the law to make sure that that body, that person, and his or her or their remains went with them? And I think that, that led to this big kind of debate that I think is still ongoing, which is who is best to make those determinations, and does science prevail in the court of public opinion, if not federal law, in making those determinations using empirical methods alone? Like, we have the evidence. We can tell you that this is Choctaw or Cherokee or Catawba. We know better than anyone else because we have at our disposal all these tools, as opposed to Native American descendants just asserting an affiliation based on, say, oral tradition or quote-unquote mythology or some really sketchy sense of their ancient past. So that's like the second decade is just like wrestling with that dilemma. And then the last 5 years, I've just come around personally, and I think a lot of my colleagues would agree with me on this, to just total deference. I'm in a position now of just saying, look, I may have pretended that I know what I'm doing for the last 25 years. I may have written a lot of books and articles describing persons and places and things and activities of the ancient past, but that's only through the lens of Western science. And it's very limiting, and it's not necessarily accurate. So I'm at a place now where I think I've just reached the point of accepting that I don't know as much as I thought I did, and nor does my colleagues in the profession, and that we could really benefit by turning over much of our interest and investigation into the ancient past over to those who are truly descended from those who made that past, right? The Native Americans of today. And that doesn't mean that Native America wants or needs us around to participate in that process, but by deference, I'm basically just saying, before I do anything in the future, including building a new program in archaeology, a new MA program in archaeology, my first step is to go to the tribes and just say, what is it do you think we should be doing? And hopeful that I'll get a positive response of collaboration and partnership, but perfectly willing to walk away if the answer is nothing. We don't need you, right? That's where we are. I think that's where we are right now. It's a scary time if you're young in the profession. I'm 65, I'm a few years out from retirement. I got nothing to lose. I hate to make it think that gives me justification for like being deferent to Native North American, but I do think that it's the right thing to do. I just don't know if I was 35 if I'd be able to count on a job as an archaeologist with that shifting political landscape. So,
yeah,
a lot of change.
Yeah. I mean, you were talking about NAGPRA in there. Do you want to talk? I mean, you mentioned how when it was instituted, institutions, I'm assuming also UF, didn't have the capacity to actually comply with it. Can you talk more about that issue of trying to comply with that law?
Well, I would say that that's true across the board. It wasn't just UF's problem alone. It was a professional dilemma that the law appears, there really wasn't much of a build-up to it. It was pretty sudden. And it was actually started by Daniel Inouye, the senator from Hawaii, as a law protecting Native Hawaiian patrimony. And so it got expanded to all of Native North America. So I think it's fair to say that the profession was a little bit blindsided, and they were certainly brought in at the 11th hour, and UF, like any other place, was probably divided. I don't know for sure, but I would imagine that some of the staff at the Florida Museum were eager to participate and get that process underway. Others were resistant. They saw it as perhaps, I know this is true elsewhere, maybe not at UF, but certainly that it was a threat to standard operating procedure, a threat to science, a threat to Western dominance, the ivory tower no longer having control over its activities and its collections and so forth. So there's still that debate, there's still that problem, there's still individuals that are arguing that this was the worst thing that ever happened to our profession. Florida Museum, like any other repository, had legal obligations to deal with it. They couldn't ignore it. Ignoring it would have potentially resulted in suspending federal support, financial support for the institution. So it wasn't just the museum that was, nervous about this. I think the University of Florida in general. But, only staying on the sidelines and not participating in it directly, I really don't know what the discussions were like. But I do know that starting in the late 1990s or maybe the year 2000, the Florida Museum got pretty serious about organizing themselves. So they created a committee. They didn't have funding, but they had willing subjects. And then, what the law stipulates is that they inventory their entire collection for all skeletal remains and all associated funerary belongings, and then reach out to native tribes that potentially have affiliated relationships to those materials, right? So some affiliation. In other words, are these the descendants of the individuals and the things buried with those individuals, right? And if so, then reach out to them and let them know you have them. And I think the mechanism for doing that is actually is pretty sterile. It's basically publishing your inventory in the Federal Register. Mm-hmm. And there's a necessary time for it to be published. And then if you don't get a response, I think in the early days of NAGPRA, the belief was, we're done with that. We can sign off on this one. This collection can stay here with us in perpetuity because no Native American group made a claim on it. It turns out that the law doesn't have any statute of limitation. Yeah. It also is now quite clear that direct descendancy is not required. In fact, it's been expanded to even in the state of Florida, for instance, I think geographic proximity is sufficient. So the Seminole tribe of Florida, their stance on any claim is that if it's within the state of Florida, it comes to us. And then even if it's in Creek territory in Alabama and Georgia, it comes to us. So they've been doing a great job just basically being really proactive, going around and, seeking collections in national repositories like the Smithsonian, as well as museums like the University of Alabama, of course, Florida Museum and so forth. Florida Museum did due diligence early on, but it wasn't enough because they have quite large collections. Yeah. They have over 3,000 human remains and thousands of associated funerary belongings. So it'll take a staff to do that to the letter of the law. And if you want to do the spirit of the law, it's going to take a staff plus another 10, right? Yeah. So what they've done now is that they've done the right thing. They've hired a full-time NAGPRA coordinator, Catherine Smith, and she wasn't part of the president's task force. She wasn't hired yet. Mm-hmm. But the hiring was in the offing, so we knew when we were convening as a task force that they were moving in the right direction. That was part of the happy news of doing this report, was that the NAGPRA effort is accelerating. It's got good traction now. She's excellent, and she's doing a great job establishing trust and professional working relationships with not only the Seminole and the Miccosukee, but with all the southeastern tribes to which some of these things may be repatriated through affiliation. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I think it's, if I can add, in talking with the Seminole Tribe of Florida, the representatives there from the Tribal Historic Preservation Office, particularly the director there, and they just created a new office called Heritage Environment Resource Office. HERO is their acronym. The former TIPO archaeologist is now the director of HERO, and then the new director of the TIPO's office is an actual Seminole member of the Seminole tribe. The other guy's non-member, but a huge advocate and operative for them. In talking with both of them recently, I started serious conversations with them last summer about development of this new MA program and having their input on their priorities and making it good for them, right? They've expressed satisfaction with the University of Florida, And I think it's fair to say that they would consider UF to be, if not the best player in the state, one of the best players in the state. And they have plenty to compare against because they have some bad actors in the state, right? So I think they know what's working, and we seem to be doing, at this point, pretty good work. So it's gratifying.
Yeah. No, I'm really glad to hear about the relationships and actually improving from the past. At least, it hasn't been the best, but from what I'm hearing right now, it's, we're moving towards a better, brighter future, I guess you could say. Although,
I think so.
Although at the same time, I do look at the numbers. I did print out the enrollments right here, and you are right. It's below 1%. We're talking here 0.24% of students.
1/4%.
Yeah. By 1/4%. And half of those students, most of around 46-48% already senior year. So they're about to graduate, which means it's going to drop the numbers even more. But I guess my concern here is, how do we, now that, relationships hopefully might be getting better or are somewhat starting to get better, how do we bring more students into this university that could be interested in their history? But also, is UF doing are they teaching adequately enough courses for Native American students on their history, on their culture?
How much time we got?
How much you want?
All right, this is a great question, and I'm definitely the best person to talk to about this because I'm retiring in 5 years, and I'm dedicating the rest of my time, the rest of my time to the development of this new terminal MA program in consultation with the Seminole Tribe of Florida. But also, I just took over the American Indian and Indigenous Studies program this past fall from Richard Conley. And I've done a lot. I'm not here to extol my virtues, but I've done a lot, just groundwork and administratively and fundraising to raise the profile of that program manifold since I took over, and the goal is to keep that going. So to answer your question, how do we attract Native American students to the University of Florida? Okay. Well, having a American Indian and Indigenous Studies program with high visibility, lots of opportunity, robust programming is a start. And so that's something we can control. The question is, this is always an issue. Back in 2008, the program started at the urging of students. There were Native American students that were part of a group called 500 Nations, particularly this fellow Adam Reckloval, I can't pronounce his last name, so don't hold me to that. Muskogee Creek. Very engaged, charismatic, persuasive. He wouldn't take no for an answer, but he came to us in anthropology, and he came to Robin Wright in religion. And at the time, John Moore was still around, the late John Moore, who is an ethnographer of Plains Indians, particularly the Cheyenne. And John, well-meaning, John seriously listened to Adam's request that we develop more curriculum, and we have a program, we have a minor, we have a major, maybe we have a degree at some point in Native American Studies. And John's answer was, we don't have critical mass. We just don't have the numbers. What are you going to do with 1/4%? You can't run a major. You're never going to get that through the Board of Regents, the curriculum committees, and all that stuff. You have to show need. You have to show demand and interest, right? So John was reluctant to do that, but I wasn't dissuaded. Neither was Robin Wright. So John didn't participate, but Robin, myself, and a handful of others created this loose program. I call it a consortium. It doesn't have a budget. It doesn't have a physical home. It doesn't have an administrative connection to anything really other than who steps up and volunteers to participate. So we're changing that now a little bit because we have two things going for us we didn't have before. One is we got an endowment from the widow of Alfred Cave, who was a professor of history at the University of Toledo. He actually taught at UF for a short while. But he was a specialist in a lot of things Native American. He's known best for his book on the Pequot War up in New England. But he's also wrote this really cool book on revitalization movements and prophets and Vision Quest and all kinds of cool stuff. Just a great scholar, a guy that garnered a lot of support in not only the profession but from Native American colleagues. And when he died a few years ago, his widow, Mary Kovlovsky, donated, created an endowment. It's not a huge one, but it's enough to generate some funding for student scholarships and for programming. So that was languishing. It's only been around for, I think, 2019, so it's 4 years now. It was already languishing just a couple years in. COVID, kind of put the kibosh on a lot of it. There wasn't public programming going on or anything like this. But as soon as I took over in the fall, the first thing I did was I went to the foundation. I said, put me in touch with her and let me talk. And so we've talked frequently since then. We email a lot, and she's really excited because what I promised her was that we would make good use of that funding. It does two things right now. It provides scholarships for anyone who's pursuing the history, archaeology, culture studies of Native North America. And then there's enough money there for programming, but we also have this other fund, which is my fund, which is the Brown Endowment for Florida Archaeology. As long as it has something to do with the Southeast, I can draw on that funds as well. So we went off with both barrels this spring. We brought in Amazonian tribal representatives. We had a big event over at Smathers West, or Smathers East, room 100. I think we had 200 plus people there for that. Wow. Mike Heckenberger, my colleague, arranged for the visit of the Kwikuru tribal chiefs and his heirs. And then we had Claudio Sant come down from the University of Georgia. He published a book about 3 years ago now called Unworthy Republic. It's basically on Indian removal in the Southeast, and it won a bunch of awards. It was a finalist for National Book Award and so forth. So it was a big deal to have him down here. And that takes money, because honoraria and travel and all that. So we have some funds now, and we have momentum. And the other thing I did was I just reached out across campus and just asked anyone dealing even remotely with Native American or Indigenous issues to join us. So we went from 8 or 9 members to 16 or 17 overnight, pretty much. And also made a deliberate effort to reach out to Latin American studies, because even though the CAVE fund is Native North America, meaning the native tribes of north of Mexico, we obviously have a thriving Latin American studies program here. And Carmen Martinez Novo, who's the head of the Indigenous Studies program there, she's a member of our group. And with Carmen, I just said, hey, what can we do to make more robust and active ties with you to attract more students? So having this program healthy and growing and getting more visibility is the first, right? Okay. The second thing.
That's good. I love it.
Okay. The second thing is actually ties back to the task force. Okay. And I think this is what ultimately, when you first emailed me, is like, I have something I'd like to share that is not quite public yet, but I've been floating these balloons in various places to see if any of them burst. As you know, from the task report, the thing that I took from it, the thing I got out of it that I didn't know before, was that land-grant universities were predicated on the sale of Indian land west of the Mississippi. And this is long after Indian removal. So, that's the 60s. 62 was the Morrill Act was passed during the Civil War. Indian removal was an act of 1830. So we're talking about 32 years later, the land-grant university, the Morrill Act was passed. I naively, and I think most of my colleagues would agree, just assumed that, and not looking into the details, I just assumed that piece of legislation enabled universities like Florida, University of Georgia, and just about all the other states in the Southeast that have thriving programs now. And of course, this is nationwide. The biggest recipient, I think, is Cornell. Yeah. MIT even, has money from land grant. I just assumed, and I think a lot of people did, that it was physically the land we're on.
Yeah. Granted to us.
Yeah, this land in Gainesville, this hog town, which is, Podunkville, Florida, is granted to the University of Florida to create universities. And I always thought this is a great thing. Isn't this a great thing? Now we can break the dependency on higher education we have with the Ivies and create institutions in rural parts of the South and across the nation to enable just average people to go to school. right? It's the democratization of the academy, right? We're going to basically open up the doors, and it doesn't have to be that you're from wealthy, privileged people to go to Harvard or Yale or something like that. Wrong. Land grant status meant basically you're given scrip for land that the government either acquired through treaties with Native peoples, most of which, the vast majority of which, were unratified, meaning they were on paper, but they were never agreed to, nor were the terms fulfilled, right? And then in some cases taken through no treaty agreement at all, and in a handful of cases by force. So here we are, in the 1860s and on, right back where we started, which was basically taking away Indian land. The Indian removal gets all these Native people west of the Mississippi. Now they're on various reservations scattered throughout the western United States. Start chipping away at those holdings as well, and then making that available for sale to universities like the University of Florida in the form of what they call scrip. So the University of Florida got scrip for 90,000 acres of land west of the Mississippi that was expropriated, I should say, from 120 different tribes across 9 different states. Wow. That was an eye-opener. And it wasn't me discovering this. It was this great investigative team for High Country News, which included a Native American scholar and then an historian, or I guess he's an historian, who's at Cambridge University in England. So they put together this incredible database. They put it into a GIS platform so they could do graphic displays of the connections. You've seen the pictures of those maps and stuff. They're really fabulous, right? Mm-hmm. That was a landmark piece of journalism. It kind of changed everyone's perspective instantly, but it took a while for it to catch on. And so I'm leading up to this. When I wrote the section in the President's Task Force on that, I wasn't scheming, I wasn't thinking about how to parlay this into resource or opportunity. But then after this all was signed, sealed, and delivered, posted on the website, I guess it's been about 4 or 5 months ago, I got an email from an historian at Texas A&M University who is organizing a consortium of representatives from land-grant institutions in the Southeast to put our heads together to figure out what we can do about this newfound information. Right. How can we parlay this into something productive, which you're asking, right? Okay, so we met by Zoom for 2 days. It was funded by a grant she had. And I learned by reading all the materials supplied for this 2-day workshop that MIT and the South Dakota State University are proactively developing capacity for increasing Native American representation, not only in the student ranks, but in the faculty and in curriculum programming, across the board. They're proactively taking the land grant argument and convincing their board of regents and governors or whatever the hell they got that it would be the right thing to do to take the proceeds of that initial land grant and invest it in Native American studies. Oh, wow. Okay, wow. So I did the math on this. It was only by the time it was invested through, the land grant institution wasn't UF per se, it was the Florida Agricultural College in Lake City. Yeah. Okay, they were the land grant institution, but then, everything got consolidated with the Buckman Act in 1905. Yeah. You know this history, yeah. Okay, so I did that. I took those numbers and I just ran some back of the envelope calculations. If we were just going to deal with inflation, it's worth like $2.3 million today. That's just inflation. If we set it in an interest-bearing account, which of course that's what endowments are in, at a low level of return, say 3%, it's more like $7 or $8 million today. Mm-hmm. So I used the low end of this, and I wrote a proposal. And it exists on paper. It's like a 4-page proposal that basically says, I'm requesting that the University of Florida set aside out of its now well over $1 billion endowment. I think we're close to $1 billion. Yeah. We're We're billion-ish.
Yeah, we're definitely there.
Yeah, we're well-endowed university for a public institution. We're not Harvard.
Not yet.
We got not yet. But this is what, whenever they do capital campaigns, it's not just to get money to spend.
Right.
It's get money to put into interest-bearing accounts so we can continue to have a stream of money and wean ourselves off of legislative dollars, for state budgets. So all I'm asking is that they take $2 million of their near $1 billion endowment and earmark it for Native American studies and Native American scholarships. Okay, what does that come out to? That would be $80,000 a year of spendable income. That's not a lot, but you could do a couple of nice scholarships a year. You could do a hell of a lot of programming with that kind of money, right? And it's a drop in the bucket as far as the university is concerned. So then how do we translate that into results, more in Native American students here? That's a little bit of a problem. Well, I think ideally what I'd like to be able to do is reach out to the 120 tribes directly affected, find out who's descended from them. And this is what South Dakota State and what MIT are doing, I think. I'm pretty sure this is what they're doing. Reach out to them directly and say, we are the recipient of the expropriation of land of your ancestors. We'd like to create a scholarship for your students today who want to come to university but perhaps can't afford it, to come to UF and get an education in whatever they want to do. They don't have to study Native American. They come study chemistry.
That's right.
Study history, study English, whatever they want to study, but get them here with some support, right? Now, as you well know, many Native American tribes, including no doubt the descendants of the 120 whose land was dispossessed for UF's origins, right, don't have a lot of cash. Many of them don't. Contrast that with the Seminole tribe of Florida. Why don't we have more Seminole students here? Everyone from the age of 1 gets $128,000 a year, so by the time you're old enough to go to college, you're a millionaire. I don't think people come to UF because they don't have to. If you want to come to UF and get an education out of curiosity, that's great, but they're not coming because they need to make a living. And I understand that. If I had $1 million at age 18, I'm pretty sure I wouldn't have gone to college. It has nothing to do with race or ethnicity or gender or sexual orientation. It has to do with access to cash. If you're guaranteed that kind of money every year for the rest of your life, why would you ever think about spending 4 years listening to white people like me talk at you, right? So I think that we have an uphill battle here, which is that we can't necessarily count on, even if we build capacity and opportunity, we can't count on Native American people just showing up. Build it and they will come? I don't know. But I think if we actually had more specific knowledge about who was disenfranchised by the land grant that UF benefited from, we should be proactively reaching out to them and saying, hey, Pomo, the Pomo of California, Hidatsa communities of the plains, or whatever, if you got any students who want to come to school and can't afford it, we got a $30,000 a year scholarship for you.
Well, I love what you're doing. Reparations. That's
I don't use that term.
How come?
Because it's got that bad connotation. It's also associated with
Fair
reparations for slavery.
Right.
As soon as you say that, anyone who's anywhere's right of center shuts down.
No more listening.
You're taking away something from me.
Right.
UF is never going to give up its institution and just turn it back over to either African American or Native American constituencies. That ain't going to happen. But we certainly can build more equitable futures.
There you go.
Right? So if reparations can be forward-thinking rather than retroactive, I'm all for it. I think most people could be convinced it's not a bad investment. My proposal I wrote it for anyone who cares to read it, but I sent it up the chain of command. You got to do that. In my old days when I was younger, I'd send it right to the president. But I know where that goes. That goes right into the file here. So I sent it up to the dean. Our associate dean isn't convinced yet that it's going to move anywhere further. And I'm out of it because I'm not chair anymore. So my chair thought it was a great idea. What he tried to convince the dean, and I think this is what needs to be the narrative for the argument for anybody who's unconvinced, is that it's a good investment because we're moving in a trajectory where tribes like the Seminole are gaining not only economic capacity, but incredible political power. So you want to avoid trouble down the road, start doing the right thing now, right? It could be a great investment. We're talking about peanuts too, very little money.
You know, I'm wondering, is there a way maybe you could share the proposal with us? That maybe that's something that
totally.
we could actually put on the podcast. It would be great. Like,
I'd be happy to share it with you.
Yeah, we'd love that.
So what I'm doing, I'm being a little subversive in sending it to persons that have no authority, but maybe some influence.
Okay.
And so I've just been sending it around. In fact, I sent it to Wynn Phillips, who's the chair of the presidential task force. Wynn's been great. You know, when he took over, I didn't know him other than he was the former head of the research division here at UF. And I knew that he was an engineer. I knew that he was quite good at doing that. I didn't know that he was a chief of staff for the president until the president called and said, I want you on this task force, and Wynn Phillips is going to be the chair of it. But I got to know Wynn, and one of the things that Wynn's been doing ever since we shut down that thing is emailing me links to every story he sees in like the Times or the Post having anything to do with Indigenous America. And he's always putting notes like, thanks for opening up my eyes to this.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah, I feel good about that because it's something he didn't really know about. So I sent him a copy of the proposal in the hopes that as he's like spending his retirement at cocktail parties with these other powerful people, that he'll be an influencer, you know, to get the word out, right?
Yeah.
You got all this on tape? Be careful what I say.
That's really, it's so interesting because it feels like a close parallel to something we were just talking to Dr. Sensbach about kind of a similar sort of consortium. I believe there's
for slavery.
About slavery, yeah. And some schools, which ones, it's not coming to mind, but
a lot.
Using, yeah, but especially, I think it was maybe Georgetown specifically that found the descendants of the people that the school sold as slaves to pay for itself and offered scholarships.
That was just in the papers yesterday. It pops up every few weeks.
Yeah. But I feel like these two things are kind of in parallel in terms of universities facing down these legacies and trying to make it right now.
Totally.
What is the pushback? What is it like to be in that force trying to make this happen?
I don't know the African American side of it the way that John does. I mean, he's thigh deep into that. Adrienne as well. She was the instigator of that.
Oh, yeah.
I'm a little disappointed that UF hasn't agreed to join, but we got caught between administrations. So the task force was created. It wasn't long after that President Fox announced that he was stepping down.
Yeah.
And then, you know, that was a long process of transitioning into our new president. And our new president then hasn't been all that he hasn't been that
visible,
vocal. Yeah, I don't know what he thinks about anything at this point. But the biggest problem is that we don't have a provost. So we just got the first email this morning from the interim provost, right?
Right.
But it's going to be another 6 months or more before we have an actual provost. And it's going to take them 6 months or more to settle in. So we're in this like limbo time. And so I think the reason nobody signed off on the African American Consortium is that they didn't feel like it was a decision they could make because they wouldn't be there to see how it unfolds. Yeah. That could be read two ways. You could see that as like being a coward or not having, you know, the chutzpah to do something bold and big. The other one could be legitimately, you know, this is a big thing. I don't want to take responsibility for it and then run out the door. That would be an irresponsible thing to do.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know how these guys think. But I don't know why it's so controversial. It's not like joining the group isn't like a pledge that we're going to like, you know, go on strike as a faculty unless there's reparations made to African Americans instantly. You know, it's a goodwill effort, and I think, you know, there's always synergy that comes from having a lot of like-minded people together, thinking about ways to strategize and move forward. So that's on the radar big time. Reparations for the descendants of slaves. The Native American thing is still kind of like under the radar.
Right.
And it's definitely under the radar in Florida.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say it's under the radar in Oklahoma
Right.
or Arizona or California, but it's definitely under the radar in Florida. Okay, now why is that? Well, I think one of the things has got to be that the Seminole Tribe of Florida entered into a pact with Ron DeSantis. And you may have seen the commercials when it first was signed. It was about 2 years ago. It's a gambling pact. Basically, the upshot, I think, for the Seminole Tribe of Florida, it's going to prevent any other entities from taking a piece of the pie. Mm-hmm. The upshot for the state of Florida is that the Seminole are agreeing to multi-billion-dollar revenue sharing. So this is a mutual relationship that's beneficial to both parties, which means that I think that Native American issues are not part of the woke agenda of Ron DeSantis. And so, that's a theory, that's not fact, that's just the way I think about it. I'm a little cynical about that, but I do think that that's part of it. And then frankly, because we don't have Native American students here, it's not unusual for me to have a class like Indigenous Values or North American Archaeology, which I teach every fall, and have students come up to me a week or two in and say, Professor, I didn't even know that Indians were still around. Yeah. You couldn't say that about African American people. I mean, you're living in the South, you'd have to be living in a cave somewhere not to know that they make up a sizable fraction of any population in the South, and in some places, majority populations, right, in the South. But to know that Native Americans are thriving is to be with them. Mm-hmm. You're not going to know it just by hanging around at a football game or going to the mall. You're not going to see, Miccosukee or Seminole people walking around in traditional Native clothing, even though they might be there. They're just not there. You just don't see them, right? Mm-hmm. So,
well, I mean, I'll say it doesn't help that the place at UF where you can see them is at the Florida Museum in the First Encounters exhibit. In terms of,
well, First Encounters is gone.
They
that
have
was a
gone
traveling
rid of it by now.
Oh, that was the 80s.
I might be mixed up. Was the one with
the South Florida exhibit?
Yeah,
is the one that has exhibit. The Calusa and the Seminole.
Yeah,
they're featured prominently. It's pretty much the Calusa exhibit, and then the Seminole are tacked on at the end. Let me tell you a little bit about that though, and there's good news there too. It's very much like the good news that you guys have with the oral histories that they're being. Mm-hmm. We by the way, we're using the term rematriate now. Rematriate. You guys, okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, I learned that recently.
I meant to say that's what the Catawba were using.
Yeah, and I've learned that recently. They're all matrilineal societies. Mm-hmm. So to say repatriate is kind of a European bias, right?
Yeah.
So there's good news on the horizon because for the same reasons that we could commend you guys for what you're doing with the oral histories. So the South Florida exhibit opened up in early 2000s. Mm-hmm. And, that's when they built that new museum. So as they were building the new museum, Powell Hall, the new exhibits museum, they were developing, obviously, the exhibits. So Bill Marquardt and Darcy McMahon, Bill Marquardt's retired now, Darcy's still there. Darcy's an exhibits person. She's in charge of exhibits, I guess you could say. Bill's the curator of South Florida archaeology, now retired. They collaborated with the Seminole for the development of that exhibit. Mm-hmm. So that was, 20-some years ago. The collaborations were healthy, productive. I think everyone would regard them as positive. No problems there. That was 20-some years ago. All right, well, now 20 years later, you look at what we have, and it's not considered to be an accurate and beneficial narrative to the Seminole tribe. Yep. The accuracy is a matter of debate. But here's what the Seminole Tribe of Florida would like to see: greater emphasis on continuity. Mm-hmm. Not that, they came down from Alabama and Georgia in the 1700s and bam, now we have this Native American constituency we didn't have before, and they survive to this day. They thrive through today, right? What they were arguing, and I endorse this as an archaeologist, is that they were always part of a network of alliance, marriage, rituality, pilgrimage, you name it, right? They were always part of a much broader regional community of Native peoples that at the level of, say, at least religion and cosmology and social organization, they had a lot in common, right? So they we tend to think of dicing them up based on language or customs or material culture. That's what we Europeans do, right? We're Cartesian. We try to like break everything down into its components, and then we lose sight of the forest for the trees. So the Seminole now want the forest to take forefront and the trees to be part of the background here. So Michelle Lefebvre, who's now Bill Marquardt's replacement after he retired, she's the curator of South Florida archaeology. She's actively negotiating or collaborating with the Seminole to revamp the entire exhibit. So the new exhibit is going to emphasize the continuity. It's going to give them purchase on making claims for matrimony. Patrimony? You can't say matrimony. That's something altogether different. Matriation. It's going to give them a stronger foundation for it, because it's going to be a collaborative effort, not just the native people saying this is who we are and where we came from, but archaeologists with archaeological science backing some of it out. Now, where's the science come in? Well, in the past 20 years, Neil Wallace, in particular over there, one of my former students who's a curator of Florida archaeology as well, has been using a lot of geochemical sourcing of clays from pottery to show that these networks, are manifested in the transfer of ceramics all over the region, right? So if we just went on language groups at the time of European contact and we stopped the clock, everybody's got their territory, they're all separate from one another. But if we let it run out over a generation and we never showed up and we could from the sky virtually look down upon this world, we would see everybody moving constantly, right? Didn't wait to the 1700s for the Seminole to come down. They spent time in the Everglades before, their ancestors did. Yeah, so the museum is doing good things. You guys are doing good things. The American Indian and Indigenous Studies program is doing good things. Anthropology is doing good things. What we got to do is get the visibility of all those good things out there, so that, and everybody agrees that we're doing good things, so that we can start asking for more resource. After that proposal I wrote, I don't expect it to go anywhere, but I expect it to be having my foot in the door, right? To where I can go in a couple of years to the dean and say, look, I'll stop being a gadfly if you give me a recurring budget. And I'm not asking much. Give us 20 grand a year for programming, so we can bring in Native American speakers, not just people who study Native America, but actual Native American scholars. And then Mike Heckenberger and I both are committed that when we retire, we want our positions to be replaced by Native American scholars. And the best way to do that is never retire until they're just ready for you to go. They'll do anything to get rid of you.
I see.
I love the plan.
These are very simple strategies.
I like the visibility aspect that you're mentioning. Provide more visibility to Native Americans. How can you do it through programming? That's one of the key things first. And that makes sense. You can't just jump in and ask for too much money if we don't have the demand for it. But until you bring and build that visibility, well, then you could start bringing the people. And once you bring in a few folks, then have those folks even ask for more. And then that's when you start, implementing and creating programs.
Precisely.
Yeah.
We don't want to be presumptuous and say, we don't want to say, we can have a massive public program, say, in November for Indigenous Heritage Month. Right. Let's do a powwow. We'll invite the Seminole and Miccosukee and anybody else that wants to show up here and fill up the Plaza of the Americas with dancers and music and food and all that. That's presumptuous because that's their gig. I went to the Seminole, we took the Amazonian chiefs down to the Seminole tribal fair and powwow. Whew. Man, that was something. I didn't realize how big it was, how lavish it was, and how many participants they had from all over the continent. It was enormous. But the big stuff like that. And in the meantime, I just got an email over the weekend. WUFT is going to participate in the PBS, the second series of the PBS program called Native America. It's a series. It started in 2019. They're doing a second season. It's all going to be contemporary issues. Before it was archaeology and the ancient past. It's all going to be contemporary stuff now. They wanted to know if American Indian and Indigenous Studies program would be a sponsor. It only costs us $600 to have 15-second spots before and after each show for 4 weeks over the month of half of October and early November. That's great visibility.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah, yeah. So little things like that add up. And then we want to be prepared when the quote unquote, you know what, hits the fan. And that can happen like it did back in 2006. I probably have the wrong date here, but they're out there working at the Bauman Center, putting in that garden. I think it's called the Fick Gardener, Fick Garden, F-I-C-K-E, Fick Garden. And they disturbed a Native American grave. They didn't do adequate survey to prevent that from happening. And even though UF has been pretty good in terms of land altering activities, they get casual sometimes, and sometimes their priorities shift to where, you know, they got a deadline they need to meet. They don't want to ask the question, is there any Native American remains going to be disturbed here? If it ever happens again, that's the kind of visibility we don't want to have,
Right.
but we want to be prepared in that moment to tell them what it's going to take to remediate that kind of problem.
Yeah.
And I think this is what happens. I mean, this basically, George Floyd is murdered in the streets of Minneapolis. And not everybody, but many university administrators in charge, like President Fox, took action by creating task force, programming, expanding their DEI initiatives, you know, all that kind of stuff. And in that moment, it's so invigorating. It's like, God, society's really finally becoming more just. We can actually take, George Floyd's not going to die in vain. We can take his murder and make good things out of it. You know, I don't mean that sounds kind of weird to say it that way, but I think you know what I mean. He could die, he would have died for causes that 10 years from now we look back on and go, what a sacrifice of himself to a better world. And now I'm sitting here thinking, no, it didn't happen. We went through that process. How much of it was performative? How much of that was just like ameliorating our own angst over being white?
I mean, let's just look at today's political climate, period. I mean, how much has it been resolved, you know, or talked about at this point? But
yeah, it seems like we're headed backwards, right?
right, that's what I said last time, actually, same thing, right?
Yeah.
We're going 2 steps, we go 2 steps forward, but then we go 3 steps back.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, astrologers call it retrograde, right?
Retrograde,
Yeah.
Right. What is one thing from the report that you wish everyone at UF would know? If you had to choose and pick one specific thing, like
Well, from my point of view, the land grant, the specifics of the land grant.
okay,
I don't think that I was the only naive person in the crowd. No one in that committee said, you know, of course we've known that forever. It really was a revelation. And I think it would be a revelation for most people to find out that UF was predicated on an investment of land from 120 different tribes across 9 states west of the Mississippi. It's a shocker. And it may be insignificant from the point of view of where we are today, but it is our founding. So even though it was relatively small compared to, say, like, you know, University of Georgia had a much larger land grant. The university, it was all calibrated to the size of the white population. So Florida was at the low end at that time. You know, we haven't, even though it was a state and it was growing, it was nothing like it is today. Right. I mean, if it happened today, we'd be at the high end, you know, of what was granted. But even though it was small and insignificant relative to other investments necessary to get a university like this up and running, it doesn't take away from the dispossession, just the whole wrongness of it. It just wasn't the right thing to do. They didn't have to do it that way. They were still operating of the sense that those Indians had no intrinsic or inherent right to land, because in the mind of Western European descendants, they weren't land-holding people. They were moving around all the time. Get back to that thing that I was saying about how everybody's moving around. Land isn't property to them. Land isn't territory to Native people. Those are concepts that we foisted upon them, and then, you know, basically compartmentalized their spaces into reservations, and then through the Dawes Act, even breaking up reservations into private property lots. You know, that was an effort not only to make them more like us, but to disable them from having tribal synergy. by having, if you break up the crowd into smaller groups, they're less threatening to you, right? Less powerful, right? So.
Yeah. I mean, in terms of talking about, universities trying to do something and make these, the task force was, as you were saying, like an example of that felt extremely major at the time. But I guess maybe you were alluding to this before. Once it was completed, what then? What do you think that UF did a good job or did anything at all to kind of put it out there or draw attention to it? Has it had
No, they did
impact?
not. No, they did not do a good job. Okay, so it didn't take long for the task force members to come to understand that our job was to report but not to recommend. And so this was something that we had a hard time negotiating right up front. The chair of the task force, Wynn Phillips, no background in history, smart guy, really smart guy. I'm not taking away anything from his intellect, but he doesn't have an education in history or culture studies or anything humanistic, right? He's an engineer. He told us literally that our job was to write a history and that the history would be best structured around a timeline of events. In fact, there was never any plan from his point of view to write a report at all. We were going to do a timeline. So Paul Ortiz, David Canton, John Sensback, the historians in the crowd, and myself included, I'm not a historian, but I damn well know history is what we make of what happened in the past, not what actually happened in the past, right? It's like not just a chronicle of facts and events and persons, it's an interpretation. And you have to you have to make inferences based on incomplete information. So we kind of educated him that history is not this sterile, vanilla, neutral, impartial way of looking at things in the past. We did a timeline as part of the report, but as we wrote the report, there was always this tension that we not write anything that would be perceived by the reader as critical of UF.
Not possible.
How do you write about anything in the past without criticizing the things that led to bad outcomes, right? You have to work backwards and forwards as a historian to see its relevance, right? And then he didn't want recommendations. Now we haven't talked about this, but I actually, when I was asked to join by President Fox, I was like, first of all, I'm not Native American, so I'm not going to represent Native North America as anything other than a white Western European descent, right? And then there's no one else in the committee that had, other than John Sensback, that had any purchase on Native North American history at all. I felt like I was the token member. It was about African American injustice. Throw in Native Americans, okay. I told President Fox when he asked me to join, I said, I can't represent Native American history, but I can represent how modern society deals with land that was originally, obviously, before Europeans showed up, all of Native American. And then we have legal obligations to manage it in ways that don't destroy evidence of that past. That's what I do as an archaeologist, right? So laws to protect when they put a new building out here, if there's a Native American grave there or a campsite, that we have ample opportunity to document what was there before it gets destroyed. I mean, that's, it's a modern concern, but it's tied to the value of this ancient evidence, this evidence of ancient times, right? So it's an interesting problem, right? I think he understood what I was talking about. I'm not quite sure, but he said, I think he was just desperate to get somebody to be on the committee. He's like, I imagine he went to Wynn or his staff and said, give me a list of all the Native American professors on campus. And they came back and said, well, there aren't any. Or there's a few. There's a few now. And actually one hired since George Floyd was murdered. So he asked me to do that. So I immediately asked in the very first meeting if I could create a subcommittee. And then it had to go through a discussion, debate, and ultimately, just an informal vote. So I went and found 2 Native American students to join the committee, Natalia Turkle and David Brendan John. And they were fabulous. And then I went around and got other colleagues that I knew had stake in all this. So Robin Wright, Richard Conley with American Indian Indigenous Studies, Neil Wallace, and Donna Rule from the Florida Museum dealing with the NAGPRA stuff. Janessa Mahar, who you guys know, right, dealing with the oral history. I think that's it. There might have been another. So, we as a subcommittee, we're playing by the same rules of the entire task force, but we actually did draw up recommendations.
Yeah.
And that was the last part of our report. And when I sent in the draft, and our subcommittee was fabulous. We got our report together. Everybody we were firing on all cylinders. It really was a collaborative effort. Everyone's throwing in. We were excited. Mm-hmm. It was like, here's an opportunity to do something good. So we wrote recommendations. That was the last part of our report. I sent it in for review. Wynn came back and said, this is great, except you got to drop that last section. Yeah. So I still have it on my computer somewhere. It's like 8 bullet points, and it includes things like you were bringing up, like how do we attract students here and retain them and graduate them of Native American heritage.
Can you recall any of the other ones?
Scholarship monies, creating a permanent home for American Indian and Indigenous Studies, a physical home for it, a center, creating a center. Hiring more NAGPRA staff. Campus-wide survey, using existing resources. All these years they've had obligations under the law to evaluate the impact that their activities are going to have on archaeological resources. Never once have they asked the archaeologists on campus for help. The only time they did, I shouldn't say never, they did it once. They asked, under contract, they hired me, I hired my PhD student Asa Randall to come up with a new management plan. And our plan was basically not to their liking, because instead of shrinking the area of responsibility, we expanded it. And we were told by Linda Dixon, the head of construction and planning on campus, that they were not going to abide by it. They basically just immediately dismissed it out of hand after they spent like $10,000 having us develop this nice plan. It was all GIS based. It was lots of statistical analysis involved. It was pretty sophisticated. It was a good piece of work. I'm really disappointed that they turned it down like that. So my recommendation was that we start a campus-wide program. Talk about visibility. If you went out as a student between classes and you saw archaeologists digging shovel tests every 30 meters across all of campus, you'd probably want to know what they're up to. Yeah. And then, the alligator would be doing stories, and then maybe it'd show up on UFT. Right. We would get the kind of visibility that Harvard has an ongoing excavation on campus. Wow. University of Wisconsin-Madison has a really thriving campus archaeology program. We could take students out and do training. We invite the public in. It'd be great PR. And it would cost them virtually nothing. I mean, literally, when we did our recommendations, I added up the numbers. We're talking about less than one full-time administrator. Wow. In the University of Florida, since I've been here, the administrative ranks have... Yeah. And the budget along with it. I mean, some of these guys are making $250,000, spend $50,000 a year doing something other than that, and let's see what comes out of it. Mm-hmm. So they didn't. The 2 problems with the report was that we weren't authorized to make recommendations, nor be critical. So Wynn went through with his red pen, and he struck terms like, I remember David Canton in his chapter had something like, after the Black Thursday incident, UF was forced to take action. Mm-hmm. He'd cross out forced and put in something like encouraged, caused. I mean, something other than force, right? So that's the biggest problem. And then the other one was just it was just put out there without any fanfare, no press release. Mm-hmm. If it weren't for Paul doing that public event over there in Smathers, I'm not sure that most people on campus would even know that this thing existed. And even then, I think most people on campus do not know it existed. I'd imagine it's only a select 5 or 10% that's even aware that it was done.
Yeah.
This should be like a freshman guidebook, you know, when you enter UF. Know your
Should be in the
history.
syllabus.
Part of the preview packet.
There you go.
Yes.
That's
Can
what
you imagine that? DeSantis would have a
Oh,
fit.
God. What did I sign up for?
Here's your indoctrination packet.
Yeah. Have it done by Monday.
Right.
Well, that's all of the questions pretty much that we pre-prepared.
How's our time?
Yeah, for
It's been about an hour
17.
20.
Hour 20,
Cool.
Yeah.
give or take.
Well, that's great, guys. This is a really good thing you're doing.
Yeah.
you.
I mean, do you have any closing thoughts or anything else you just want to put on the record while we have you?
Advice to the administration or advice to the student bodies, incoming student bodies?
It's going to sound like platitudes, but you know, biologists understand this pretty well, and I think anthropologists do as well. Diversity is not a weakness; it's a strength, because it gives you the nimbleness to respond to change. I mean, if everything was standing still in our world, we might find the sweet spot and just stick with it. It's never going to be like that, right? So diversity is always valuable for being resilient, because in diversity are the seeds of whatever the next iteration of being a human is going to look like, right? And I really do think that and particularly with Native America, we're seeing a lot of press these days. It's pretty encouraging that Native American, what some people call traditional ecological knowledge, you know, we covered a lot of this in Indigenous values class, is really efficacious. It's like there's a lot of like stuff that Native peoples know from being in the world for millennia that science hasn't come upon yet and may never come upon, because it plays out in the long term. And so, you know, I do think there's much to be gained that has value for all people by cultivating, encouraging, curating the knowledge of other people, right? Making space for that and not pushing it aside as if it was quaint or antiquated or obsolete.
Right.
Yeah.
So
100%.
I think that's all.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. That'll conclude our interview.
Cool.